The millionaire's daughter had never spoken, until he caught the black nanny and his daughter singing, a melody that made his world fall apart in seconds. Richard Blackwood stood in the doorway of the nursery, frozen, watching his 6-year-old daughter sing a song in perfect French, while Kesha, the nanny he had hired out of desperation, accompanied her on the piano. Isabella, diagnosed with selective mutism at the age of 3, hadn't spoken a word in over 2 years. And now she was standing there singing like an angel. "What the hell is going on here?" Richard roared, making them both jump. Isabella immediately fell silent, her blue eyes filling with terror, while Kesha quickly got up from the piano bench. "Mr. Blackwood, I can explain." "Explain." Richard stormed into the room, his voice laden with a fury that made Isabella run behind. "Kesha, explain how you made my daughter talk when the best specialists in New York said she might never speak again." Kesha Johnson was 28 years old and knew exactly what that tone meant. In the last 2 months working for the Blackwood family, she had come to realize that Richard saw his daughter as a failed project, a social embarrassment that needed to be hidden from high society events. The man spent fortunes on expensive therapists who treated Isabella like a lab rat, but he had never tried to simply talk to her. "Sir, Isabella has always been able to speak. She chooses when and with whom she speaks," Kesha replied calmly, placing her hand protectively on the girl's shoulder. "She chooses." Richard laughed scornfully. "She's 6 years old and practically mute. The doctor said it's a serious neurological disorder. And suddenly you, a nanny with no medical training, can cure her in 2 months." The contempt in Richard's voice was unmistakable. To him, Kesha was just another replaceable employee, hired because her salary demands were lower than the specialized agencies that had given up on Isabella after a few weeks. "I didn't cure her, sir. I listened to her," Kesha said, feeling Isabella squeeze her hand. "Isabella tells me incredible stories every day. She knows 3 languages and plays 4 different instruments." "Lies," Richard spat out the words. "My daughter can barely communicate. The medical reports are clear about her limitations." Then Isabella did something neither adult expected. She stepped out from behind Kesha, looked directly at her father, and said in a clear, mature voice, "Daddy, I talk. I just don't talk to people who don't want to listen to me." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard turned pale as if he had seen a ghost, while Kesha smiled proudly at her daughter's courage. "That's impossible," Richard muttered, staggering backward. "The doctors, the tests, years of therapy," Isabella continued, her voice growing stronger. "Kesha asks me what I think. You only ask the doctors what's wrong with me." The devastating simplicity of that sentence hit Richard like a slap in the face. He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and for the first time saw not a broken child, but an intelligent, self-aware girl who had been silenced by a world that preferred to label her, rather than understand her. But Richard Blackwood was not the kind of man who admitted he was wrong, especially not in front of an employee he considered inferior. His expression hardened again. "Kesha, you're fired. I want you out of my house right now." "No!" Isabella screamed, clinging to Kesha's dress. "She can't leave. She's the only one who understands me." Richard completely ignored his daughter's despair. "You've manipulated my daughter somehow. I don't know what tricks you've used, but that's enough for today." Kesha remained calm, even as she watched Isabella begin to cry silently. There was something in the nanny's determined gaze that made Richard hesitate for a second, as if she knew something he didn't. "As you wish, Mr. Blackwood," Kesha said softly. "But before I go, Isabella has something to show you. Something that might change your perspective on your own daughter. If you're enjoying this story about how prejudice can blind even a father to his own daughter's potential, don't forget to subscribe to the channel." Because what Kesha was about to reveal about Isabella would not only change the life of that family, but prove that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden right under our noses. "You have 15 minutes to gather your things and get off my property," Richard declared, pulling his cell phone from his pocket. "And if you try to contact my daughter again, I'll call my lawyers." Kesha watched the man dial a number, probably for the private security agency that looked after the mansion. Richard Blackwood was exactly the kind of person she had learned to recognize after years of working for Manhattan's elite families, rich enough to buy anything except the ability to see his own daughter as a complete human being. "Mr. Blackwood, Kesha said calmly, even though she could see, Isabella still clinging to her dress. Can I at least explain what I've discovered about Isabella over the last 2 months? There's nothing to discover. Richard cut her off, hanging up the phone. My daughter has clear limitations diagnosed by competent professionals. You're not a doctor. You're not a therapist. You're just a nanny who managed to teach a few tricks to a confused child. The word just echoed through the room like a slap. Kesha Johnson had graduated from Columbia University with honors in child psychology, spoke 4 languages fluently, and had specializations in cognitive development and childhood trauma. But to Richard, she would always be just a black nanny. He had hired for 20%, less than what specialized agencies charged. Daddy, please, Isabella begged, her first words to her father in over 2 years. Kesha taught me that I'm smart. She teaches me things the doctors never did. Richard didn't even look at his daughter. His eyes remained fixed on Kesha with a coldness she knew all too well, the look of someone accustomed to discarding people like disposable objects. Isabella, go to your room. The new nanny will arrive tomorrow morning, he ordered as if he were talking to a disobedient dog. I don't want a new nanny, Isabella screamed, clutching Kesha's dress even tighter. I want Kesha. She doesn't treat me like I'm broken. It was then that Richard did something that shocked even Kesha, who was accustomed to the disguised cruelty of high society. He picked Isabella up with excessive force, completely ignoring her screams and pleas, and handed her to Carmen, the housekeeper who had appeared at the door. Carmen, take Isabella to her room and lock the door. She doesn't come out until I've sorted this out, he said, as if giving instructions about the trash. Kesha! Isabella yelled as she was dragged out of the room, her tears echoing down the hallway. Don't leave me. Please don't leave me. The sound of Isabella's bedroom. Door locking cut through the air like a gunshot. Kesha stood motionless, processing the utter coldness of this man, who had just traumatized his own daughter to maintain his convenient version of reality. Now Richard turned to Kesha with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You have 10 minutes. If you don't leave voluntarily, I'll call security. Kesha Johnson had grown up in Brooklyn, the daughter of a cleaning lady and a bus driver. She knew intimately the feeling of being underestimated, dismissed, and treated as inferior by people who confused money with intelligence. But she had also learned something that Richard Blackwood had yet to discover. The most dangerous people are those you completely underestimate. Mr. Blackwood, she said, keeping her voice even as she gathered her purse. Can I ask you a simple question? Richard glanced at the gold Rolex on his wrist with theatrical impatience. Quick, do you really believe your daughter is incapable, or are you afraid to find out that she's smarter than you think? The question hit Richard like a punch in the stomach. He took a step toward Kesha, his fists clenched. How dare you question my ability as a father? I've spent a fortune on experts, therapies, treatments. I've done everything for my daughter. Everything except listen to her, Kesha replied softly. Isabella doesn't need more therapists, sir. She needs a father who believes in her. Richard laughed scornfully. Parenting advice from a babysitter, in her 20s, who doesn't even have children. What a joke! Kesha opened her purse and took out a small digital recorder. Mr. Blackwood, over the past 2 months, Isabella has told me many things. Stories about how she feels when the doctors talk, about her as if she isn't there. How sad she gets when you cancel dinner parties because you're ashamed to take her out. How she pretended she couldn't walk properly during a doctor's appointment because she realized that the more limited she appeared, the more attention she got. Richard's face gradually palled as Kesha spoke. Your daughter is not mute. Mr. Blackwood, she is a brilliant child who has learned that silence is the only way to get affection in a home, where being different is treated like a disease. Richard violently snatched the tape recorder from Kesha's hands. You weren't allowed to record anything in this house. This is invasion of privacy. Isabella gave me permission, Kesha replied calmly. She wanted someone to finally hear her voice. And there are many more recordings, sir. 2 hours of conversations where your daughter demonstrates an advanced vocabulary, knowledge of classical music, and an emotional understanding that would impress any psychologist. Reality began to form in Richard's eyes like a distant storm. For the first time, he understood that he had completely underestimated not only his daughter, but also the woman standing in front of him. What do you want? He asked his voice. Kesha smiled for the first time since Richard had entered the room. It wasn't a smile of victory, but something much more dangerous. The expression of someone who possesses information that can destroy carefully constructed worlds. I want you to stop treating your daughter like a failed project and start seeing her as the extraordinary child she has always been. But more than that, she paused, pulling another recorder from her sleeve. I want you to understand that some people you consider just employees know exactly how to document inconvenient truths. From the hallway, Isabella could still be heard crying in her locked bedroom, calling Kesha's name. The sound cut through the tense air between the two adults like a constant reminder that at the center of this battle of wills was a 6-year-old child who just wanted to be understood. Richard looked at Kesha with a mixture of anger and something she recognized as fear. For the first time in his life, he had found someone who was not intimidated by his money, his social status, or his threats. Someone who possessed something he could not buy. The truth about who he really was as a father. Every new humiliation Richard tried to inflict only fueled something inside Kesha that he couldn't see. A determination forged in years of fighting prejudices far worse than his. What this privileged man didn't know was that every act of contempt was providing her with exactly the ammunition she needed for a war he didn't even realize he was losing. Proving that sometimes the greatest strength grows at the very moment. Others believe they have broken our spirit. 3 days had passed since Kesha had been expelled from the Blackwood mansion, and Richard believed he had finally solved the problem of the inconvenient nanny. He had hired a new caregiver through the most expensive agency in Manhattan, Margaret Foster, a 60-year-old British woman with impeccable credentials, and more importantly, the absolute discretion he demanded. Isabella hasn't said a word. Since the new nanny arrived, Carmen reported nervously, finding Richard in his office. She refuses to leave her room, isn't eating properly, and is making those strange noises again when she gets upset. Richard didn't even look up from his financial reports. That's natural. She needs to adjust to the new routine. Miss Foster is a qualified professional, not an improviser. The phone rang, interrupting the conversation. Richard answered impatiently, but his expression changed dramatically when he heard the voice on the other end of the line. Mr. Blackwood, this is David Martinez from the law firm Martinez & Associates. I represent Miss Kesha Johnson in a matter that may be of mutual interest. Richard motioned for Carmen to leave and close the office door. I don't know what you're talking about. That woman was fired for just cause. Interesting. The lawyer's voice was calmly professional. Because I have here a rather extensive dossier on racial discrimination and child abuse. My client has meticulously documented her experiences in your home. This is extortion, Richard roared, but his voice betrayed his nervousness. I have the best lawyers in New York. That nanny can't afford to take me on. David Martinez chuckled softly. Mr. Blackwood, you may not know that Miss Johnson, graduated with highest honors in child psychology from Columbia, has a specialization in child trauma and cognitive development, and is currently pursuing a master's degree in children's rights at NYU. She also maintains a blog on child development that is followed by over 200,000 professionals in the field. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Richard felt the floor disappear beneath his feet. But what's most interesting, the lawyer continued, are the recordings she has, not only of Isabella demonstrating exceptional cognitive abilities, but also of certain revealing conversations about how you refer to your own daughter when you think no one is listening. Richard vaguely remembered the times he had spoken on the phone with doctors, referring to Isabella as a lost cause or a dead end. He had always thought he was alone in his office. What do you want? He asked, his voice hoarse. For now, just a civil conversation. My client is not vindictive, Mr. Blackwood. She genuinely cares about Isabella's well-being, but she also won't allow a brilliant child to be harmed by parental prejudice. Meanwhile, across town, Kesha sat in a small apartment she shared with 2 fellow master's students, carefully, reviewing months of notes, recordings, and photographs. Every interaction with Isabella had been documented not out of malice, but out of an academic habit of recording exceptional child development. Dr. Sarah Chun, Kesha's mentor and professor of child psychology at Columbia, analyzed the recordings with a look of growing outrage. Kesha, this is extraordinary. Isabella not only demonstrates superior intelligence, but has developed sophisticated coping mechanisms with systematic emotional neglect. This child is protecting her own mental health through selective mutism. I know, Kesha replied calmly, and her father thinks he's healing. Isabella with therapists, who treat her like she's mentally disabled. He's causing irreversible psychological damage. Dr. Chun picked up one of the recordings where Isabella sang an entire opera in Italian. With your permission, I'd like to present this case at next week's Child Development Conference. It's a perfect example of how family biases can mask giftedness. Not yet, Kesha said carefully, putting the files away. First, Richard Blackwood needs to understand that his daughter is not a problem to be hidden away. She is a gift that he is wasting. Back at the mansion, Margaret Foster tried unsuccessfully to get Isabella to eat something during dinner. The girl remained silent, pushing her food around her plate with a distant expression. She used to be like this before the other nanny arrived, Richard explained coldly to the new employee. This is her normal behavior. Don't be fooled by theatrical tricks. Margaret, an experienced professional, watched Isabella with growing concern. In 40 years of caring for children, she had never seen a girl so clearly traumatized, being treated with such indifference by her own father. Mr. Blackwood, she said cautiously, perhaps the child would benefit from a more personalized approach. She obviously possesses above-average intelligence. Isabella has clear limitations diagnosed by experts. Richard cut her off. Don't encourage fantasies. That's exactly what the previous nanny did, filling her head with impossibilities. That night, after Richard retired to his office, Margaret tried a different approach. She sat down next to Isabella and whispered, I know you can hear me, sweetheart. You don't have to talk if you don't want to, but I would really like to get to know you better. Isabella looked up for the first time in 3 days. Slowly, she wrote something on a napkin and handed it to Margaret. Is Kesha coming back? It read in surprisingly mature handwriting. Margaret looked at the girl, seeing for the first time not a troubled child, but a desperately lonely little girl. I don't know, sweetheart, but I do know that you are much more special than anyone in this house realizes. Isabella smiled sadly and wrote another sentence. Kesha knew that. As Margaret tried to process the emotional complexity of the 6-year-old, her phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. Hello, Margaret. I'm Kesha Johnson, Isabella's previous nanny. I know you're a serious professional, and that you must be noticing strange things in the family dynamic. If you want to talk about what's really going on in this house, please reach out to me. Isabella needs our help. Margaret looked at Isabella, who had fallen asleep on the couch, still clutching the napkin with her questions about Kesha. For the first time in her career, an experienced professional, Deal found herself questioning whether being in a home was more harmful than beneficial to a child. Across town, Kesha was finishing organizing what she had begun to call Project Isabella, a complete documentation that would prove not only the girl's genius, but the systematic neglect she suffered. David Martinez had made it clear that they had a solid legal case, but Kesha wanted something more satisfying than a court victory. She wanted Richard Blackwood to publicly acknowledge the extraordinary daughter he had ignored for years. Because some men only learn when they lose everything they thought they had. And Richard was about to discover that he had underestimated not just a competent nanny, but a woman who would turn every act of contempt into fuel for a justice that would completely reshape Isabella's future, proving that sometimes the best revenge is simply to reveal the truth that people try so desperately to hide. A week later, Richard Blackwood woke up to a series of notifications on his cell phone that made his blood run cold. The first was an email from the New York Department of Children's Services, requesting an urgent family welfare assessment for the Blackwood home. The second was a missed call from his personal lawyer. The third was a message that would change his life forever. Mr. Blackwood, press conference today at 3:00 p.m. at Columbia University's Children's Rights Center. Your presence is recommended. K.J. Richard rushed to his office and immediately called David Martinez. What the hell is going on? Why does social services want to evaluate my home? Mr. Blackwood? His lawyer's voice was tense. You need to come to my office right now. We have a much more serious situation than we thought. An hour later, Richard was sitting in a conference room, watching a presentation that systematically destroyed everything he believed about himself as a father. Dr. Sarah Chun one of the country's most respected child development experts, conducted the presentation with surgical precision. These recordings were made over a 2-month period by a qualified professional with the express permission of the child, Dr. Chin explained, playing the audio of Isabella singing an entire opera in Italian. As you can hear, the girl possesses not only exceptional vocal ability, but linguistic mastery that indicates giftedness. Richard was pale but tried to maintain his composure. These recordings were made without my permission. They're illegal. David Martinez shook his head gravely. Actually, they're not. New York law allows educational documentation when there is suspicion of child development neglect. And there's more. The next recording was even more devastating. Isabella's voice clear and articulate, explaining to Kesha, "Daddy always tells the doctors that I don't understand things. He talks about me as if I'm not there. Yesterday, he said on the phone that I'm a non-return turnable investment and that maybe he should send me to a special boarding school." Richard felt his world collapse. He vaguely remembered that phone call, thinking he was alone in his office. "There are 17 hours of similar material," Dr. Chun continued relentlessly. "Isabella consistently demonstrates superior intelligence, emotional stability when treated appropriately, and a painful understanding of how she is perceived by her father. But the worst was yet to come." The projector screen showed a series of medical reports from the last 3 years, all signed by Richard, all downplaying or distorting Isabella's actual abilities. Most disturbing, Dr. Chin said, is the correspondence we discovered between Mr. Blackwood and Isabella's therapists. Emails where he explicitly asks them to maintain diagnoses that justify her social disability. His exact words. Richard tried to stand, but David held him back by the arm. "Sit down and listen. It's not over yet." Kesha Johnson entered the room carrying a bulging folder. She showed no anger or vindictive satisfaction, just the quiet determination of someone who had meticulously documented an injustice. "Mr. Blackwood," she said calmly, "for 2 months, Isabella told me about how she pretended to have greater difficulties than she actually did because she realized that the more limited she seemed, the more attention she got from her father, a 6-year-old child manipulating adults to get basic affection." Richard finally exploded. "You manipulated my daughter. You taught her to lie, to pretend she has abilities she doesn't have." Actually, Dr. Chin interrupted. "The neurological tests we've done over the past few weeks confirm that Isabella has never had any cognitive limitations. The selective mutism was a response to systematic emotional neglect." Kesha opened the folder, revealing hundreds of drawings, musical compositions, and even short poems that Isabella had created during those 2 months. "Isabella didn't need to be cured, Mr. Blackwood. She needed to be seen." "But the doctors," Richard stammered. "The doctors responded to your expectations," David Martinez explained coldly. "When an influential and wealthy parent repeatedly insists that their daughter has limitations, professionals tend to find evidence that confirms that narrative, especially when that parent pays very well for convenient diagnosis." The final blow came when Dr. Chun played the most recent recording made, just 3 days earlier, with Isabella conversing fluently with Margaret Foster about philosophy and advanced mathematics. "What amazes me most," Isabella's voice echoed through the room, "is how Dad never realized that I always knew he was ashamed of me. I just pretended to be more limited because it seemed like the only way he would pay attention to me." Richard collapsed into his chair. All his arrogance evaporated. I just wanted to protect her. I wanted her to be normal, happy." "You wanted her to fit into your version of normal," Kesha corrected gently. "And when she didn't, you'd rather believe she was broken then, except that maybe your definition of normal was too limited." David Martinez placed a document in front of Richard. "The Department of Children's Services is considering a supervised joint custody plan. Isabella will continue to live with you, but with mandatory psychological counseling, not for her, for you. And there's more." Dr. Chin added, "Isabella will be integrated into a program for gifted children at Columbia, where her abilities will be properly stimulated. Miss Johnson will be her official educational tutor." Richard looked at Kesha with a mixture of anger and something that looked like despair. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to be the father Isabella deserves," Kesha replied simply. "I want you to see your daughter as the extraordinary child she has always been. And I want you to understand that some of the people you consider just employees may see treasures that you yourself have overlooked." Today's press conference, David informed him, will present Isabella's case as a groundbreaking study of how family biases can mask giftedness. Miss Johnson will be recognized as an associate researcher at Columbia. Richard finally understood the full extent of his defeat. Not only had he lost credibility as a father, but the simple nanny he had despised was about to be celebrated nationally as the person who saved a gifted child from years of intellectual neglect. "Does Isabella know all this?" he asked, his voice breaking. Kesha smiled for the first time. "Isabella helped plan everything. She really wants her dad to learn to see her for who she is. She told me, 'Kesha, Daddy isn't bad. He just forgot how to look at me without being afraid.'" The forgiveness implicit in those words from a 6-year-old was more devastating to Richard than any legal punishment could have been. He had been defeated not by anger or revenge, but by the wisdom and compassion of his own daughter, a girl whose genius he had systematically ignored, because she didn't fit into his narrow mold of normality. As the adults finalized the legal details of that family revolution, one question hung in the air. Was it possible to rebuild a father-daughter relationship when the father himself had discovered that he had spent years fighting ghosts he had created, while the real treasure was right in front of him, waiting patiently to be recognized for what she had always been, an extraordinary child disguised as a problem to be solved? 6 months later, Richard Blackwood sat in the front row of the Columbia University auditorium, watching his 6-year-old daughter receive a Medal of Honor for Academic Excellence. Isabella, now fluent in 5 languages and the composer of 3 original musical pieces, shone on stage like the child prodigy she had always been. "Daddy," she whispered as she stepped off the stage. "Are you proud of me now?" Richard hugged his daughter, tears streaming down his face. "I've always been proud of you, Princess. I just had to learn to see it." Kesha, now a nationally recognized doctoral candidate and child development consultant, watched from the audience alongside Dr. Sarah Chun. Her book, Invisible Children: How Prejudice Kills Potential, had become a bestseller. Richard approached her after the ceremony. "Kesha, I'm sorry." "You don't need to apologize," she interrupted gently. "You need to keep being the father Isabella always knew you could be." Margaret Foster, who had become a key ally in the family's transformation, smiled as she watched Isabella run through the garden with other gifted children. Kesha's true revenge was not to destroy Richard Blackwood, but to transform him into the father Isabella deserved. She proved that sometimes the greatest victory is not defeating our enemies, but saving them from themselves. If you believe that every child deserves to be seen for their true potential, not what others expect of them, subscribe to the channel. Because when we stop judging by appearances and start really listening, we discover that the greatest treasures are hidden behind our own prejudices.